Greetings, welcome to Baba Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, we continue our conversation from last week regarding the nature of African spiritualities as plural rather than singular African spirituality. And we look more so in the Americas. Of course, we can also touch a little bit on Eurasia as well. Now, the question I want to put forward to all of us is there is a distinction, I argue, between Africa based spiritualities and, of course, African influenced spiritualities. What do I mean? First, let me explain and then I'll get to the question, the essential question. By Africa based spiritualities, I mean these are spiritualities or spiritual systems, if you will, that come directly out of an African ancestral homeland and therefore cultural and historical context, right? That has been baked over centuries, in fact, millennia. Africa influenced spiritualities or philosophies are those in which people of African ancestry have and still continue to influence that may come from other cultural, philosophical traditions. For example, Islam, variants of Judeo-Christianity, Buddhism, you name it, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a distinction I draw. And here's the question, right? To what extent do these Africa-based spiritualities, I'm calling them, and the African-influenced spiritualities and philosophies, to what extent are they African? And does that really matter in terms of what is the outcome or expected outcome of practicing and engaging these spiritualities, right? That's the floating question for us today as we continue part 2 of our conversation about African spiritualities and rethinking a lot of what we think or come to assume about African spiritualities. Let's start with a few case studies, right? Let's start with the Circum-Caribbean Basin. And let's think about the island of Hispaniola, which of course houses Haiti and Dominican Republic. Let's focus on Haiti for a moment, right? And so Haiti, much like Brazil, has been shaped, spiritually speaking, right, by, and we put Catholicism to the side for a moment, has been shaped by the peoples that came largely from West Africa, in this case, Yoruba, Fombe, and Greater Moor, and of course, West Central Africa, the Bakongo peoples. Out of these peoples, there was, of course, a combination or admixture that occurs, but at the same time, there's also specific holding on to among these cultural groups whereby certain lines or borders are maintained in terms of what is Yoruba, Fombe, or Bakongo and what is not, right? So you have both happening where there are lines that are drawn about keeping intact what is specifically that particular cultural group offering in terms of their spiritual practice. And there's also what? A melting of those borders at the same time. So these things are both happening at the same time, right? And the same is true in Brazil. In Brazil, they refer to this particular composite under the umbrella of candomblé, right? Which of course I talked about last week in our first part of this series, right? So in Haiti, you have this, and the umbrella term in Haiti or Haiti is voodoo, right? And so voodoo is actually more umbrella term that houses or that underneath sits these three powerful variants of Africa-based spiritualities that coming from the Bakongo people, that is West Central Africa, the Fombe people, what is now Benin, to lesser extent Togo, and of course Yoruba, largely in the country of what is now Nigeria, right? Now there are other folks there as well, but these are the predominant features, right? And we find that this particular umbrella term voodoo is also finds its way into New Orleans and into New York because, of course, folks from Haiti have migrated throughout the 20th century, if not before. And once these people migrated, they populated these major urban centers like New Orleans, which of course has its own particular blend of spiritual practices there, right? In New York and other major metropolitan areas along the East Coast, but certainly on the West Coast as well, right? So that's one example of these Africa-based spiritualities that come directly from an ancestral homeland that has a lineage, that has centuries, in fact, millennia of histories, and of course, social and practice, right? therapeutic practice as well. In Jamaica, for example, you find a different variety, whereby in Jamaica, West Central Africa has a predominant role because they were the last wave of large groups of African people to populate the island of Jamaica in the 19th century. The same is true for some of the Yoruba and other folks that came. But it's West Central Africa that had tended to one out in terms of the practices under tradition referred to in Jamaica as kumina or kumina, right? It's also referred to in dancehall music as pokominia. In fact, there was a dance called the Pokomanjam decades ago in the heyday of dancehall reggae music, right? Which basically stylized what was the cultural spiritual practices of Kumina practitioners. Kumina is also referred to under the banner of Obia, right? Which of course is a very loaded term, but we can talk about in the Q&A, or if you have any particular questions, you can certainly reach out to me for that. And I've referred some books too along the way. Nonetheless, Obia, Kumina, and these are also referred to under the general name of science, right, in Jamaica. And so these are Africa-based spiritualities that come because Kumina has, the vocabulary of Kumina is largely Kikongo, which is spoken by people in West Central Africa, along with Kimbundu, but also Kikongo in terms of the language used in the cultural ritual practices of Kumina. And so Kumina or Obia or science comes from this traditions. However, in Jamaica, you have another layer to add, right? Which you find in other places as well in the Americas. You have the variant or the factor of European witchcraft, right? It takes a hold. In fact, the term science comes out of this particular history of European witchcraft, essentially finding its way with the European migrants and slavers and so on into places like Jamaica and other English-speaking countries, Antigua, Barbados, Bahamas, etc. And you have another factor as well, which is the variance of Protestantism that takes a hold in places like Jamaica and other English-speaking portions of the Caribbean, right? And so these factors of Protestantism or Anglicanism, they also, begin to not only influence, but they also adopted certain features that are married to the African-based spiritualities like Kumina, right? And so you have really a more composite, and therefore even some might argue more powerful blend that comes out of it. And the same is true to an extent, in Brazil, where again you have those variants, but you also have indigenous spiritualities among the indigenous peoples, or what's left of them in the contemporary period, that blends with these African-based spiritualities. And then, of course, you also have the feature of espiritism, this sort of movement that comes out of in the late 18th, 19th century, that also is blended with both the indigenous spiritualities as well as the Africa-based ones that comes from West and West Central Africa primarily, right? And then you have other places, in the Caribbean, basin, and really in the Americas at writ large, that have these features. Now, let's talk about some of the African influenced spiritualities, right? So, Islam among African practitioners have been in the Americas at least for 500 years, right? In fact, many of the earlier African practitioners of Islam or African influence Islam, whether it be Sufi or another variety, but primarily Sufi Islam from West Africa, you'll find that these also made their way to the Americans. So you had African Muslims that also began to populate places like Brazil. So among the Africa-based spirituality, you also had African-influenced spirituality, which is an African form or interpretation of Islam, right? In Brazil, you don't have it as much in places like Jamaica, but you have all in the U.S. South. You have African Muslims there. In fact, there are some great books. You can start with Michael Gomez's Exchanging Our Country Marks. That is Exchanging Our Country Marks with Michael Gomez, who's a history professor at NYU. Check out his bibliography. There are tons of other works there about African Muslims. And of course, I can put some in the description as well if that will be helpful. And of course, your questions and comments below, I can also provide some other resource. So African Muslims provide another sense of base. And so by the time, for instance, in the United States, when Faradi Muhammad meets Elijah Muhammad, a sharecropper in the U.S. South in the early 20th century. And out of Elijah Muhammad, he moves to Chicago, and he finds what becomes the Nation of Islam, right? And so um, Elijah Muhammad's, understanding of Islam comes to Faradi Muhammad from the Moorish Science Temple, which, of course, is an Islamic based organization, again, in the early 20th century, who had a particular, view of Islam. Elijah Muhammad takes that view and, of course, forms and fashions the Nation of Islam, which it differs from Orthodox Islam and, of course, the varieties that both in West Africa in terms of Sufism, but also in terms of other forms of Islam, whether it's Wahhabism, whether it is Shia or Sunni. So there are different denominations or varieties of Islam, those brought by the earlier enslaved Africans and some of them non-enslaved Africans to the Americas, but also the later varieties that come to shape the Nation of Islam in the early 20th century, right? And so the Nation of Islam becomes, not an African-based spiritual or religious organization, but it's essentially an African influence, meaning that the people of African ancestry fashion and make Islam work for the material and social conditions, political conditions in which the people find themselves. In other words, they make it work for their particular needs, right? And the same is true for those groups that splinter off of the Nation of Islam. For example, the 5%ers, or the 5% of gods and earth, they are a group that comes out of the Nation of Islam, right? They have their own particular view that is inspired by Islam, but has, of course, certain philosophical and practical, sort of doctrines that depart, from both from Orthodox Islam as well as from Islam practiced by Nation of Islam, right? And then you have, going back to Jamaica, for instance, you have the phenomenon of Rastafarianism, which, of course, takes its cue, right, from Judeo-Christian theology, but it has what? An African influence. The idea of his Selassie coming out of Ethiopia, and of course, is an African basis, African link, however mythological that may be, but there still is a belief system that's built around that is what? African inspired. This is what we mean by the African inspired, African influence, sort of spiritual practice. And out of that practice come certain rituals that includes, but not always, these gatherings, these Nyabingis, the use of marijuana, the use of certain kinds of ritual, a sort of vegetarianism, sort of veganism, that becomes part of lifestyle, the locked here. Those all becomes ritualized in terms of this particular spiritual religious practice referred to as Rastafarianism, right? And that is shaped again by the cauldron, not only by the heat, but by the various Africa-based spiritualities and the European supplied philosophical and spiritual and religious practices, as well as interpretations made by a group of men of African ancestry in the early 20th century that found what later become known as Rastafarianism, right? And so we have those. Now we also have, in the United States, at least, other formations that are African inspired. Take, for example, the Osar Osset Society, that takes a hold largely in the 80s and 90s, right? And it's still existing today with chapters, in certain parts of the United States. But they take their inspiration from their understanding of ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt, right? That is the philosophy and the cultural practices as far as they interpret it. And they begin to develop not only an organization, but rituals, divination, practices, lifestyles around this conception, again, African inspired, right? Because we don't know how and what the ancient Egyptians or Kemetic people thought about what they did and said, because we don't have any of them as descendants to say, yes, that's what we thought, that's what we believed. And we don't have any speakers of their ancient languages to, again, correct, confirm, or supply a different alternative view. And so, out of that context, one has to, take what that society offers in terms of, the particular practice and how, one might say, the interpretation of ancient Egyptian spirituality and the practice of that spirituality in the modern times If there's a direct line from one to the other, meaning from the ancient world to the present world. That's a question, it's a floating question that we can think about, right? And there are others as well that come out of this nexus of African-based spiritualities and African-inspired spiritualities, right? Which I can go into, but I'll pause there for now to give us a chance to breathe and kind of, extrapolate some of the main takeaways about these African spiritualities and come back to the central question, which is how African are these Africa-based and African-inspired and African-influenced spiritualities? And that's a question for you to think about. And does it really matter in terms of what it offers those people who take on, those beliefs and make it their own, right? Ultimately, it's for that person to decide, the values and worth that those spiritualities have for them and utility that it has for them, meaning how does it work for you? But certainly there is a historical context, right, and a cultural context for interpreting these spiritualities, making sense of them. And so here's some key takeaways, is that out of all these African-based and African-inspired and African-influenced spiritualities, what you find is that there is a clear view of a almighty, supreme being that animates all of them. There's an emphasis on both spiritual forces and figures in nature as well as ancestral ones, right? And sometimes the two, in fact, cross lines. That is, they converge and merge into one category, one form. Second is that singing, dancing, that instrumentation, that is music, is some of the three ingredients that are ritually important to all of these spiritual practices, right? And it makes sense. That is, whenever you have, movement, dance, instrumentation, music, singing, voice, you always have a spiritually charged environment and atmosphere, right? It's always charged when those elements come together and engage the divine. And so those features, are throughout both Africa-based and African-inspired spiritualities. Another feature that you find common, to all, whatever our view may be about their own particular dogmas, what you find is that they supply something that those people who seek them, and so in supplying something that seekers, desire or need, it fits something that is out there, that a need that's out there, which makes us ask a bigger question, right? What is the need, that these spiritualities satisfy or fulfill in these peoples in the world, right? Particularly for African descended people, African, peoples on the continent of people of African ancestry. What does these spiritualities supply? What needs do they satisfy? And do they still satisfy these needs, right? In a world where, we can get answers perhaps quicker from Google, at least some believe, than from a spiritual force or entity. In this so-called modern world, spirituality and religion is not the only or most important answers to life essential questions, right? And so these are important questions to think about in the second installment of this conversation. And I'll leave you on this note. A key feature, in all of these practices is that the creativity and the wisdom of African people is on display in terms of what they do with both other traditions, making it their own or adopting or adapting them, and their own homegrown spiritualities, remixing, adapting it to fit their particular needs, environments, and of course, the demands of life and living. That is one thing that is clear throughout all these Africa-based and African influence and shaped spiritualities. For Baba Nyame, I've been your guide and host. Until next time, stay well. Drop your questions and comments in the section below.